Disclaimer. An assortment of cautionaries is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual places is purely coincidental. The stories presented in this podcast are original works created for entertainment purposes only. Listener discretion is advised as some content may be unsettling, disturbing, and triggering.
Hello. I see that you're back again. I'm Grim Maiden, the keeper of stories, at your service. Tell me, was it a good read? Ha! My recommendation almost always makes the mark. But before I can help you today, I went through the confessions repository and found something else. I waited for you, if you've got the time today. Look, this one came with a note. Hear this. Beware the call of the unknown. Do not take that which is not meant for you. Quite the warning. It's supposed to be a handwritten note left by the late Martin Sterling, an esteemed collector of exotic things, and a patron to the town's natural museum. This confession was left by his housekeeper, Miss Anne, upon his demise. The newspapers arrived this morning. They hadn't heard from my master in weeks since he set off to his expedition. The telegram confirmed that Martin was dead. I was not shocked, but I also never imagined that he would meet such a fate so soon. The telegram said he was found in his chamber, lifeless. It just didn't fit right. Given Martin's career and his hazardous occupation, for him to lie lifelessly in his chamber was odd for someone so young. Most people would have predicted something tragic. That was the extent he went to find the things he did. It was a fate he accepted long ago, and one that I undertook by being a part of his life. But there was no time to mull things over now. What's gone is gone, and the museum had asked for assistance in cataloguing and removing Martin's collection from his beachside home. They expressed it is their duty to preserve his legacy. In truth, they were merely scavenging to monetize his personal collection before they moved on to the next collector to show off. The museum people were what you called entrepreneurial. That's how they run things. But there are some things I decided to keep away from the eyes of the coroner and the museum. Martin's journal entries, for a starter. Those entries were a testament to his collection, his life's work, and his obsession for the strange and the odd. He didn't collect artifacts or trinkets, unlike the other collectors of the Duskhaven district. Martin was famous for collecting living things. His study was a menagerie of exotic flora and fauna, each specimen rarer and more mysterious than the last. He would spend hours tending to his collection, studying their habits and behaviors, jotting down every small detail in his entries. The museum loved his exhibition lineup, although Martin have confessed to me several times that the councilmen have the impression that he may be even slightly loose on the head for the things he brought in. He was mad, is what they all said behind his back. One of the most striking creatures in Martin's collection was a nameless winged creature. The closest species that resembled it was a butterfly, I supposed. He came across it in a swamp, somewhere along the straits. Martin called it the phantom wing, for its wings were not quite there, but under the light one would be able to catch its glass-like wings. But that was not the oddest detail about it. You see, Martin always had an eye for a detail. Martin imagined that from a certain angle the insect had a close resemblance to a human face, The preservation process was meticulous, that he worked on it for weeks, by carefully dissecting, removing its micro-organs, and the preserving of its wings with a solution that kept the translucence vibrant. He had a technique for everything, especially the taxidermies. Among Martin's collection was also a plant unlike any I have ever seen. It is a dark shade of blue with darker veins that were almost black. Martin gave it to me as a gift, a token of appreciation for how well I took care of him in bed and his house. I decided to call it the Blue Whisper. The Blue Whisper was a mystery to Martin. He never quite understood its properties or how it came to possess such a rare color. He didn't particularly care to study much on it, despite it being placed in his own bedroom. But his specialty was in the things that moved, crawled and flew, the ones that had a mind of its own. Those were the ones that made him lose his sleep and obsess over for weeks and months, until he found the next shiny thing to capture. Now, as I look at the Blue Whisper, I can't help but feel the heaviness in my heart. We never loved, Martin and I, but he did take care of me, and I him. I took care of him well, so well that he was at home regularly. Unlike what the society and the museum assumed of him, Mr. Sterling had a good appetite for things outside his occupation. Shouldn't have come off shocking for a man only in his mid-20s, but most thought of him as a studious odd man. I mean, he was a man who lived his life passionately for exotic things, and that should have said something. One night he came home from a meeting with the councilmen who had called for a discussion, or rather a demand for something otherworldly to be brought in for the next big exhibition. All of Martin's collection had been otherworldly. To find something more bizarre than what he's already offered would be absurd. Martin came home rightfully upset, hair messy, eyes sunken and skin white as paper. He looked angry, so angry that he dragged me into the bedroom and spoke no words the entire time. I helped him release the tension. He did look a lot better once I was done, but his eyes remained worried. I asked him what the matter was. Normally he'd deem it too complex for my understanding. Fair enough, I was a 17-year-old housekeeper from across the peninsula. I wasn't expected to be smart. However, this time he looked me in the eyes when he told me that the museum was considering revoking his patronage. He explained how the council thinks that the elite society is bored of Martin's collection, and that no new donations were made in the recent months, and hence the need for something otherworldly if he wants to keep being sponsored. We both remained silent as I looked out the window where the waves crashed into the cliff in the distance. My master often overlooked the good things that he has around him in pursuit of things on the other side of wherever he was. The same way he overlooked this beautiful house by the cliff that his father had so graciously gifted him for his 21st birthday, and the way he overlooked that there was a whole ocean for him to explore for his otherworldliness. So I told him to go look into the sea. If there's anything otherworldly in Windlethorn, it's got to be in the open sea of the Straits. He looked at me horrified. It was a strange request, I'll admit, but Martin wasn't the kind to shy away from dangerous expeditions. After a moment he did consider it. He sat up on the bed, the expression on his face puzzling, and he asked me to bring something to smoke. I took it as a yes. I figured that if he's asking for a special tobacco from me, then that means he's getting ready to get to work. It was a ritual of sorts between us, one that Martin had grown accustomed to recently. I started by carefully grinding the leaves into a fine powder, mixing them with more homegrown dried herbs that Martin claimed enhanced the flavor and his mood. Once the mixture was ready, I packed it into a small pipe, tamping it down with just the right amount of pressure. Martin then took the pipe from me, his hands trembling with anticipation, and lit it with a match. As he took the first puff, A cloud of sweet-smelling smoke filled the room, enveloping us in its fragrance. Martin inhaled deeply, his eyes closing in. He began giving me more instructions, asked me to pack his tools, especially his large jars, the ones he used for preserving specimens. I watched him closely, trying to gauge his intentions. He seemed to focus as he got on a phone call. I heard him talk to someone from the Deep Voyage Company, the company that specialized in transporting goods to and from countries across the straits. He was booking himself a place on a cargo ship, not a passenger ship. It made sense. A passenger ship simply wouldn't do. Plus, it raises so many questions from the immigration. A few hours later, he made to leave home. And that was about the last time I saw my master, wholly sane. And here I sit and read the last of his journal entries from the time he was in the ship, in the sea. On the 6th day of autumn, he boarded the ship after arriving at the Bloomsmead Pier, a busy wharf in the town centre of Elderford. I've seen it once when I crossed the straits myself, to leave home and come work for Martin, when he bought me off the market. At night, the sound of the sea laps against the pier docks, I still hear it after several years has gone by. Apparently Martin had to negotiate his passage and sign a couple of disclaimers for any possible bodily damage that may incur during the voyage, and that they were anticipating a thunderstorm that night. The contract was faxed to Martin the night. I found it on one of his desk folders, and when he boarded, he had met with the captain of the ship, Captain Thorne, who showed Martin to the cabin they were renting to him during the voyage. Martin's cabin was a cramped space, barely larger than a closet. There was a small porthole that let in a sliver of light, but otherwise the cabin was dim and musty. The furnishings were sparse and basic, consisting of a bunk bed with a thin mattress, a small writing desk, bolted to the wall, and a stool. A lantern hung from the ceiling, swaying gently with the ship, enough for him to set up his apparatus and start his work. As the ship set sail from Bloomsmead Pier, Martin stood on the deck, watching as Elderford faded into the distance. He made his way to the helm, where Martin had a word with Captain Thorne, who was busy with his own report entries. Apparently, the captain did not exactly share the same enthusiasm for Martin's occupation, and was in fact disdained that it had to be done on his ship. But he was in no position to deny Martin when the companies made an agreement. Soon after, the captain had asked Martin to retreat to his cabin, safe from the storm, and so he did. He had closed the door behind him, shut off the distant cry of seagulls. The further they sailed into the open sea, he was enveloped in a silence that seemed almost deafening. But that's when he heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible hum, like the distant sound of breathy whisper, yet a symphony. Despite how lovely it sounded to his ears, Martin admitted that he was scared, but he still strained his ears and tried to discern the source of the sound. He even questioned himself if he was imagining, or was it the signs of a thunderstorm fast approaching. But then he remembered the stories he had heard of the tales of the sirens, whose enchanting songs luring sailors to their doom. When the hum persisted, Martin jotted down in his journal entries of this phenomenon and felt a strange compulsion, a pull towards the sound. Curiosity got the better of him as he approached the porthole and peered outside. The sea was pitch black. As the thunderstorm raged outside, Martin kept to himself in the cabin, the mysterious hum still echoing in his ears. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was a siren's call, luring him towards danger. To cease the anxiety, he started smoking the tobacco that I especially prepared for him. When hours passed, the storm eventually subsided, and so did the song. Martin ventured out into the deck to a much calmer sea now. That's when a crewman shouted, alerting the captain that there was something afloat by the starboard side of the ship. Without hesitation, he made his way towards where the crewman pointed. As he bent over to observe, he spotted the shape of a person, their body limp and lifeless in the dark waters. As the crew lowered a rescue boat into the water upon his request, Martin climbed in. He had rowed towards the floating figure. At first glance he had assumed it was a woman, her upper body bare and her skin pale against the dark water. But as he approached, he noticed that below her waist, her body was much different than the womanly body that he is normally accustomed to. Instead of legs, she had a long, sinuous tail, covered in scales that were dim, like that of a floating dead fish he had described. While he observed, the dying mermaid had suddenly gasped for air and yanked at his hands, her eyes fluttering as she pulled him closer. He felt her cold, clammy skin and had recoiled in horror. But before he could pull back, in a haunting voice he heard her whisper low, "Save my child," she said to him. And that's when it dawned on him. That's when he had truly seen it, the lump of flesh that he saw through the skin of the mer-woman. Martin hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. He had even considered leaving it to die with its unborn offspring. What was a mermaid good for if it's dead? Nobody was going to bother with an exhibition of mythical dead things. But in his own reasoning, he suddenly had a change of mind, or an improvised idea, the way he had worded it in his entry. He thought a fetus is better than nothing and plunged his hands into her flesh. The dying creature had gasped in pain and exhaled her last breath. He carried the lump of wet flesh, writhing in his hands, and rowed away from the lifeless mother. He had quickly placed the fetus in a container of sea water that he had carried from home, and hoped that it would survive outside its mother's womb. He did not waste any more days in the sea, and had promised the captain extra funds for an early return with the fetus. He had showed it to me upon his return, this mermaid fetus, that he was so proud of. If I'm honest, although it made me happy, I was quite taken aback by how delighted he looked. Martin got straight to work. He spent hours in the library, poring over books, searching for information on how to care for the fetus, and kept the jar with him all the time, and never stopped writing in his journal. He smoked more than usual, the stress of his newfound responsibility weighing heavily on him now. Occasionally he would confide to me, telling me of his regrets at abandoning the mother. But when I asked if he would have done anything differently, Martin's response was always the same. "It was not my responsibility." The sleepless nights began to take a toll on him, and his journal entries were proof. He had written that in the days that has passed he's noticed changes in the mermaid fetus, that it grew at an alarming rate, quickly reaching the size of a newborn baby. He described its tail becoming more prominent, and tiny scales were almost visible under the light, giving off a dark blue glow. Martin was fascinated by the creature's development, but also increasingly unnerved, as he should have been. In his journal, Martin wrote of how the mermaid haunted his dreams, her image flashing before his eyes whenever he closed them. Weeks passed by, and Martin reported more growth from the fetus, its eyes sharper, its mouth filled with tiny razor-sharp teeth. And when it looked at him from its now large glass, he described he felt a sense of quiet rage emanating from it, as if it blamed him, or at least that's how he imagined it. Martin's health deteriorated at a fast pace too. He became increasingly obsessed with the mer creature and smoked more than ever. The museum called frequently, asking for updates on any progress. At first, Martin answered the calls himself, but as time went on, he asked me to answer them for him. He felt as if he was not in the right mind to give an explanation to what he was preparing for them. He was not sure if they were prepared for what he was about to offer. One night, Martin sat down in front of the glass case, larger than the jar that he carried with him. He lit his pipe and began to smoke, the fragrant tobacco filling the room. I stopped entering his room after a while, for it has become hard to breathe with him always smoking, but I watched him from afar. Then the pipe slipped away from his fingers as he slumped into sleep. Hours passed. I left to go tend to the kitchen, and Martin remained in his chair, even after dawn broke. I tried waking him up gently, not wanting to startle him, but he never responded. His face was pale and blue, eyes rolled back. He looked so dead. When I read his last journal entries, Martin had written how he believed the mermaid would one day break through the glass and come for him. Poor Martin. He had died believing that death would come for him from a glass case, from a sea creature of his own imagination. He had imagined himself a hero. But death had come to him from within, from the pipe he had smoked so diligently on a daily basis, from the plant in his bedchamber. If only he had responded differently and acknowledged my pregnancy, things could have ended differently for him, for us. I knew that he never wanted me to keep the baby, our baby that now grows inside me. He had made that clear when he did not respond to me when I announced I was with his child. I needed a way to provide for our child, and so I began feeding him the plant that he had gifted so lovingly to me, a plant that he never bothered to learn about, care for, nor sit down and talk to, the way he had bought me off the market and kept me around. It still pained me to see him talk to himself like that, lose his mind bit by bit every day, believing he had really brought in a mermaid offspring to care for when he had no interest in caring for our baby. But it was all over, and I needed to hide these journals and any more of the secret pieces that he could have left behind. The coroner might find the Blue Whisper. The contract between Martin and the Deep Voyage Company could cause trouble too, but it was part of Martin Sterling's personal collection, not mine. The beachside house, however, was signed to my unborn baby as his next of kin in his last days. I made him. So, Martin Sterling never left his beachside house. No voyage, no mermaid, no fetus. Only the Blue Whisper. You see, the Blue Whisper, or at least that's what Miss Anne calls it, is a plant not so often found in Elderford, but when you do, it leads to a nightmarish dance with the mind. Its hallucinogenic properties unleash a torrent of sensory distortions. Objects warp and twist, colors bleed into one another, and the world becomes a kaleidoscope of madness. Those under its spell may hear phantom whispers, the ethereal voices of the plant's victims, or haunting melodies that seem to seep from the very air. They might feel insects crawling across their skin, or a touch as cold and clammy as death itself. But beware, for its gifts come at a cost, one that may claim more than just your sanity.